In the last video, I shaped the metal for the center portions of the seat. So we're going to work toward joining these pieces together, and the first thing I want to do is to fasten each piece to the buck where it fits best. I've drilled 4 holes in the panel, and I'll use drywall screws to hold the panel to the buck. These screws are going into those blocks I put into place earlier. So we'll get the top positioned properly and drive a screw here. So the panel is positioned perfectly on the buck, and we're working toward fitting this piece as well. And they have a lot of overlap. I can get these pieces to fit tighter together by cutting off the bulk of the overlap. So that's the first thing I'll do. I'll flip this upside down and mark right along the edge of each of these long stations and the cross station in the center, and I'll trim off the excess. So I'll reach in with a felt tip marker, and I'm marking on the far side of the station. Okay, it's marked. So next I'll pull this apart, and I'll trim off the excess metal. I've trimmed the edges on this part and put it back on the buck, and now we'll start fitting the second piece to it. I'll flip this around, and I've left these 2 screws slightly loose so I can actually slip this piece underneath. And I have a center line on both parts, so I know how they should be aligned. And I'm going to hold this piece to the buck with some screws. Then I'll tighten the screws on the top piece. And I'll tap these together to get the best fit up I can. And now I'm going to scribe the line for trimming where the welded joint will be. And I'll flip this upside down and mark the edges to be trimmed on the bottom piece. So I can pull this apart again and do the trimming on this piece. I'll get a file and deburr this edge. Now we'll screw this to the buck again, and I'll be ready to tack weld these together. People always ask about the machine settings. Because I'm welding aluminum, the machine is in the AC mode. It takes 60 amps to weld metal this thickness, but I have the machine set a lot hotter than that. It's set to 100 amps, and I'll be riding the foot pedal as I weld to give me the proper amount of heat. I'm using 3/32 diameter, 2% lanthanated tungsten, and it's sharpened to a fine point. So I'll go along this joint making hot, fast tacks. So with the tack welds completed, I can pull this off the buck now. I'll work this joint with a hammer and dolly to get the best fit up I can before welding. The alignment is tuned up nicely, and before welding I want to clean the joint and the rod. I use acetone as a degreaser. It's good practice to degrease the rod too. And then the last step before welding is to use a stainless steel wire brush to clean the joint. So we're ready to weld. There's no need to skip around on a weld like this, so I'll simply start on one side and go to the other. So the weld is finished. I always like to go back and make a second pass on the inside for panels like this, just to flow everything together, and there's no need to add filler rod for this second pass. If there's any place where I don't have full penetration, I'll gain that penetration, and this will flow in any little stalactites I may have. So that's done a beautiful job of flowing everything together. I didn't mention the type of filler rod I'm using. This is 1/16 diameter 1100 aluminum rod, so it's pure aluminum rod. The softest grade there is, and the best match for the 3003 material the seat is made from. I'll use an 80 grit disc to grind this weld down flat. I like to use a little lubricant when I'm sanding aluminum, so this is bar soap. I'm going to hammer this joint to smooth it out, and one of the chief reasons I do this is to crush the weld flat on the inside. Also, I can refine the contours between both parts. So that's done a nice job of smoothing out the weld on the inside. Checking the part on the buck, it looks like the hammering stretched these corners a little bit. So I'm going to shrink those corners before I start wheeling this part to get the final fit. Just a little shrink should do it here on both sides. And now I'll use the wheel to smooth up the center. Just like always, I'll use a cross-tracking pattern. So the center is smoothed beautifully, and I need a little bit tighter radius wheel to do the corners. This side is smoothed up nicely, so I'll spin the part around. So this side is nice and smooth too. So let's put this on the buck and see how it fits. Looks pretty good. I'm going to put the screws into place. So the center is looking really good, and now I can start fitting the side pieces to the center. I'll attach the upper two side pieces first. So they've been put on the buck and positioned with drywall screws, and I've cut the edges back so there's only about 1/4 of an inch overlap between this piece and the side pieces. So I'm going to put this into place, and I'll get this piece positioned with the screws. And I'll drive the screws tight. So I'll tap these edges together to get the best fit up I can. And then I'll scribe the edges to be trimmed. So I'll pull this apart. Now I can pull these pieces off and trim them. I've trimmed the edges of both side pieces, so I'll get them assembled on the buck and do the tack welding. I'll use a vice grip to get the alignment on this end. And I'll put on my welding gear and start tack welding. So the first side is tack welded. I'll do the same tack welding on the other side, then I'll pull this off the buck and work these joints with a hammer and dolly to get the best alignment I can. I'll switch to a hammer with a little more curvature to the face. So I have a very nice alignment now all along the joint, and I'll do the same to the other side. Just before welding, I'll clean this joint with a wire brush. So I'm ready to weld. Okay, this side's completed. I'll flip this around now and weld the other side. With both joints welded on the outside, I'll fusion weld the inside. Okay, this side's finished. I'll flip this around and weld the other side. Now I'll sand the welds down flat with an 80 grit disc. And I'll do the same on the other side. So with the weld sanded smooth on the outside, I can now use the English wheel to crush the weld completely flat, and I can also use the wheel to refine the shape. I have the 2.5 inch radius anvil wheel and the English wheel, and I'm going to use that to start crushing this weld down flat. So I'm going to sneak up on the pressure I need, so it's rolling through with not too much problem at this setting. Let's try the other side. Okay. Then I'll bump the lower wheel up just a fraction and wheel both welds again. I'll go up another fraction. So that's done a beautiful job of crushing the weld flat. And now we'll start wheeling in the other direction to refine the shape. I'll flip this around and wheel the other side. So that's done a lovely job of smoothing these areas. And now I'll start working on this area. So that's smoothed up beautifully, both outside and inside. And I know I'm going to have to tweak the shape on this a little bit to restore the fit with the buck. Just a little bit of tweaking here and there, and it should fall right into place. I'm going to scribe the last two pieces to fit, so I'll hinge this down into place and hold it with a couple of screws. I'll hold the front end tight with screws also. And the fit's looking really good everywhere, so I'm going to scribe these edges in preparation for trimming. Alright, now I can pull this apart and trim it. So I'll put this together and tack weld it. So the tack welding is finished. I'll pull this off the buck now, hammer and dolly these joints, and clean everything in preparation for the finished welding. I put a couple of hours into smoothing these joints, crushing the weld flat by hammering, and then wheeling to restore the contour. And I carefully checked out the whole seat, and I got it as good as I can. So I'm very happy with the shape of this seat now. I have it screwed onto the buck, and it's fitting the buck quite well. So the next thing I want to do is to mark the perimeter for trimming. So I'll get this clamped onto the table for support. And then I'll use a felt tip marker to put a small dot at the end of each station. So with marks at the end of each station, now I can pull the seat off the buck, and I'll use masking tape to lay out the trim line. It'll be much easier to do my layout on the outside of the seat, so I made a hole where each of the marks were to transfer the marks from the inside to the outside. I'm going to make the cut on the front first because it's pretty much a straight line. I'll use masking tape to lay out the line. I'll lay down the tape so it just barely touches the tops of each of these 3 holes. And then I'll continue that tape out straight to each side. And now I'll use aircraft snips to cut on the tape line. So the front edge is nicely trimmed. I'll turn the seat around now and do the layout of the cut on the top of the seat. So these 3 points describe a curve, and I'm going to use smaller tape to help me develop that curve. Again, I'll just barely touch the tops of each of those holes. And now I'll trim on this line. I'm going to cut off some of the waste first. And this will be the finished cut. So the top and bottom are trimmed. Now we'll do the layout of the curved line on the side of the seat. I'll take a look at that and make sure it's a good curve. Yeah, I think that looks very nice. So I'll trim on that line. Again, I'll cut the waste off first. That makes it easier to make the finish cut. And now we'll make the finish cut. Here's the chipboard pattern I made of the curve on the first side of the seat. So I'll pull this off and clamp it onto the second side. I'll line it up with the holes. So now I'll trim on this line. Now I'll round off the corners. I made a template out of chipboard that's 8 inches in diameter, and it turns out that this is a very close match to the original seat. So I'll just slide this template up to the corner until it's tangent and draw an arc. I'll do the same on this corner, and I'll do the top corners in the same way. So I'll trim these corners and the edging will be completed. I'm going to put the final finish on this seat by sanding. I'm starting with 120 grit. I'll sand it both inside and out, and then I'll work up to finer grits. After using 120 grit on a disc sander on any rough surfaces, I like to switch to an orbital sander with 180 grit, and I'll go over the entire surface with this. The orbital sanding does a nice job of getting rid of the scratches from the 120 grit, but I'm never happy with the surface it leaves. There's always little swirl marks, and it's just an uneven surface. So what I like to do is to give it a grained finish. So this is 180 grit sandpaper on a sanding block. I'm going to sand this in a linear pattern. So the block sanding refines this surface in a way that the orbital sander can't. This really helps to flatten the surface and get out any swirl marks. But there's one more step I can take to make this even better. When you're hand sanding, it's very hard to get all of your sanding scratches in the same direction, so they cross over each other a little bit, giving you a slightly uneven pattern. But here's the fix for that. I use a sponge with a non-woven abrasive backing, and I just dampen the material and then sprinkle on a little household cleanser, and then using the scratchy side of the sponge, I go over that with a linear pattern. Doesn't take much, but it really helps to blend everything together. So I'll wash that off with water and then dry it with a towel. And that's a relatively straightforward way to get a very, very uniform bare metal surface. Now, this isn't the finest surface you can make. My friend Luke DeLay recently finished a sports car, and he took the finish all the way up to 2,000 grit paper, and it's almost like being polished. And of course, you could polish this if you want. But for my application where I want a bare metal look, this is a lovely finish I'm very happy with, and it's not terribly hard to achieve. I finished the inside of the seat in the same way. It's important to use a sanding block with the right curvature, but this one worked perfectly. So that wraps it up for this video, and next time we'll get into some of the finishing touches. I love making these videos, and I'm honored that you're watching. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell to be notified about new videos. I read every comment, and I do my best to answer all questions. If you like what I'm doing, please click the Patreon link and become one of the great people who help me create new videos.